Welcome to The Hidden Scrolls, where we focus on history, folklore, and mythology. Fairies, good, evil, or just tricksters? To start this video, I will tell you about what my old grandmother told me and my sister when we used to spend summers with our grandparents in the Swedish countryside in the early 80s. We were told to stay away from the meadows if there were any mist during dawn or dusk, because fairies could be there dancing, and they often stole, kidnapped people in her stories, and it was not given they would be seen again. The stories were far more scary than what Disney had showed us with Tinkerbell and Peter Pan. Okay, let's begin the video. Origins and etymology. The word fairy derives from the Old French fairy, meaning enchantment or illusion, which itself comes from the Latin fata, referring to the fates, goddesses of destiny. In early medieval literature, fairy described a realm of enchantment, and only later came to denote the beings that inhabited that realm. Over time, the term came to refer specifically to the magical creatures themselves, fairies. Fairies are supernatural beings that have appeared in various forms across different cultures for centuries. They are often associated with nature, magic, mischief, and sometimes malevolence. While modern depictions often portray them as small, winged, benevolent creatures, this image is a relatively recent development, especially shaped by Victorian literature and children's stories. Ancient roots. The roots of fairy lore stretch deep into pre-Christian and pagan belief systems. Many scholars believe fairies are the remnants of deities and spirits once worshipped or feared by ancient peoples. When Christianity spread across Europe, many of these deities were reinterpreted as lesser supernatural beings, neither fully divine nor entirely evil, leading to the complex and often contradictory characteristics attributed to fairies. Celtic mythology. In Celtic cultures, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, fairies were originally thought to be the Tuatha De Danann, a supernatural race of beings who inhabited Ireland before the arrival of the Milesians, the ancestors of modern Irish people. After being defeated, the Tuatha were said to have retreated underground into the Sida, pronounced she, hills or mounds believed to be entrances to the otherworld. From here, the modern concept of the Sida, or fairy folk, developed. The Irish banshee, Bean Sida, a female spirit who wails to warn of death, is another example of a fairy-like being rooted in mythology. The Sidae were not diminutive, fluttering beings, but powerful, capricious entities with control over fate and nature. Norse and Germanic mythology. In Norse mythology, beings like elves, Alfar, and dwarves, Dvergar, bore similarities to fairies. Elves were sometimes beautiful, luminous beings associated with fertility and nature. In later Germanic folklore, these elves evolved into more mischievous and troublesome spirits. The Huldra, a seductive forest spirit from Scandinavian folklore, resembles FairyLore with her beauty and hidden animal tale. Similarly, kobolds and house spirits were believed to help or hinder households depending on how they were treated. Slavic mythology. Slavic folklore also features fairy-like creatures such as the rusalki, water spirits often portrayed as beautiful but dangerous women. They lured men to watery deaths, much like sirens or naiads. Other beings like domovoi, household spirits, and leshy, forest guardians, share qualities with fairies in their roles as custodians of specific natural or domestic domains. Characteristics and classifications. Fairies have been categorized in many ways, and their nature varies dramatically across cultures. Some are helpful or benevolent, others trickster-like, and many are outright dangerous. Good folk versus malevolent spirits. In many traditions, fairies were euphemistically called the good folk, or the fair folk, not because they were kind, but to avoid offending them. The belief was that saying their true names could attract their attention and possibly their wrath. Many fairies were seen as morally ambiguous, acting according to their own rules. They might bless a kind person with fortune or curse someone who offended them, often without warning or explanation. Types of fairies. Some common types include trooping fairies, social, noble, and often traveling in groups. They lived in fairy palaces and were sometimes equated with the aristocracy of the Otherworld. Solitary fairies, more likely to be tricksters or harmful beings. Examples include the leprechaun, brownie, or boggart. Elemental spirits. Many fairies were associated with natural elements, forests, water, air, or fire. The concept was later categorized by occultists like Paracelsus into sylphs, air, gnomes, earth, undines, water, and salamanders, fire. Common themes in fairy lore. Time and the Otherworld. One recurring motif is the distortion of time in the fairy realm. Many tales recount mortals visiting fairyland only to return and find that years or even centuries have passed. This theme highlights fairies' otherworldly nature and the dangers of interacting with them. Fairy rings and portals. Fairy rings, naturally occurring rings of mushrooms, were believed to be the site of fairy dances. Mortals who stepped into a fairy ring risked being trapped in their world or cursed. Fairy mounds, stone circles, and ancient burial sites were often thought to be portals to the fairy realm. Disturbing these places was considered dangerous and sacrilegious. Abduction and changelings. One of the darker aspects of fairy folklore is the belief in fairy abductions. Fairies were said to steal human babies or adults, replacing them with changelings, sickly, enchanted substitutes. These stories likely reflect historical misunderstandings of developmental disabilities or illness. Fairy kidnappings were also used to explain mysterious disappearances. People thought to have gone with the fairies might have simply wandered off or been taken by human forces, but the supernatural explanation served social and emotional needs. Christian influence and demonization. As Christianity spread, fairy lore was increasingly viewed with suspicion. Some authorities tried to align fairies with fallen angels, explaining them as beings who were neither good enough for heaven nor evil enough for hell. Others considered them demons sent to tempt and deceive humans. However, fairy belief proved remarkably resilient and persisted well into the modern era. In fact, many Christianized communities incorporated fairies into their spiritual worldview without contradiction. Fairies in literature and art. The medieval Romance tradition featured fairy queens and enchanted knights. Perhaps the most famous is Morgan Le Fay, a powerful sorceress in Arthurian legend with ties to both human and fairy traditions. During the Renaissance, fairies were incorporated into literature with increased romanticism. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1595, featured Titania and Oberon, royal fairies, along with mischievous Puck, also called Robin Goodfellow, shaping much of how modern audiences view fairies. In the Victorian era, fairy tales and children's stories exploded in popularity. Fairies were sanitized and made smaller, cuter, and more delicate. Illustrators like Cicely Mary Barker and Arthur Rackham depicted fairies as tiny winged beings, while authors like J.M. Barrie, in Peter Pan, solidified the modern image of the fairy. Modern interpretations and revival. Today, fairies continue to appear in fantasy literature, games, films, and art. Works like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings reimagined elves, a close cousin of fairies, as noble and ancient beings. In urban fantasy and role-playing games, fae societies are complex, magical, and politically nuanced, drawing inspiration from the darker, older folklore. There's also a strong neo-pagan and New Age revival of fairy belief. In some spiritual circles, fairies are considered nature spirits or guides, and people report personal experiences with them, echoing centuries-old beliefs. Conclusion. Fairies are among the most enduring and adaptable figures in folklore and mythology. Their origins lie in ancient deities and spirits, transformed by culture, religion, and imagination over the centuries. From powerful gods to mischievous tricksters to tiny fluttering helpers, fairies reflect humanity's desire to connect with the mysteries of nature, the unseen world, and the unknown. Whether feared or adored, fairies remain symbols of enchantment, wonder, and the liminal space between the human and the supernatural. A timeless bridge between our world and something wilder, older, and far more magical.